At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, 225 Rangers jumped off the British landing craft and ran to the bottom of these cliffs. Their mission was one of the most difficult and daring of the invasion: to climb these sheer and desolate cliffs and take out the enemy guns. The Rangers looked up and saw the enemy soldiers at the edge of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades. And the American Rangers began to climb. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top, and in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe.
The teamwork and determination displayed on that fateful day at Pointe du Hoc not only demonstrates the best of the United States Army, but it also represents our mission at the Association of the United States Army. Soldiers supporting soldiers. For almost 75 years, AUSA has served soldiers, providing a voice for the Army, and celebrated those who have helped the Army community. We've experienced tremendous growth and are now over 1 million members strong and growing. We continue to provide essential services to soldiers, civilians, retirees, veterans, and family members. We engage with the Army, Congress, industry partners, and communities across the globe. And we work to advance national security and promote greater recognition of the Army's vital role in American life. But we're not stopping there. We're evolving the way we educate, inform, and connect America to the Army. We're developing our Center for Leadership to inspire Army leaders. We're investing in our Army communities with a broader membership reach. And we're building stronger links between generations to support the Army's critical needs. As we charted AUSA's path for the future, we realized we needed a new symbol to represent what we do. A logo inspired by the significance of the soldier experience and the Army story. A logo inspired by our focus on people. Because, as General Creighton Abrams said, people aren't in the Army. They are the Army. A logo inspired by the achievements of those brave soldiers at Pointe du Hoc on that fateful day in 1944. This is that emblem. AUSA. It takes a team. Soldiers, families, civilians, retirees, veterans, industry, and you.
The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Noon Report webinar series. This webinar series features presentation by senior Army leaders responsible for key programs and initiatives. It also features contemporary military authors who weave together the past, present, and future story of the United States Army. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Leadership and Education, Lieutenant General Retired Les Smith.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Noon Report. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We appreciate your support as partners in defense of our nation. Joining us today is William Nance, author of Combating Professionalism, Simpson, Moore, and the Ninth Army. Please take advantage of having Mr. Nance here to ask questions. You can use the questions and answer tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. After the discussion, we will take as many questions as possible. You can find the full bio for Mr. Nance and our moderator, Chief Warrant Officer 5, retired Phyllis Wilson, in the Handouts tab. Signed copies of this book can be purchased directly from AUSA during and after the webinar while supplies last. As stated, the moderator for today's discussion is Chief Warrant Officer 5, retired Phyllis Wilson. Chief Wilson served as the 5th Command Chief Warrant Officer for the United States Army Reserve. She is president of the Women in Military Service for America Memorial Foundation. She also serves on the boards of Policy Vets, the Allied Forces Foundation, and the Army Women's Foundation. She's also a senior fellow at the Association of the United States Army. Wilson also serves on the Reserve Forces Policy Board and is an Army Reserve Ambassador for Maryland. Chief Wilson, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, General Smith. Let me tell you a little bit about this amazing author you get to hear from today. William Nance, commissioned as an armor officer in 2002 from the United States Military Academy, and he went on to serve in Operation Iraqi Freedom, OIF-1. He earned a master's degree in military history from the University of North Texas in 2011, and then taught history at West Point from 2011 to 2014. He then earned a PhD in military history in 2014 from the University of North Texas, writing on American mechanized cavalry in World War II. Following his time at West Point, he served as a brigade plans officer, squadron operations officer, and squadron executive officer. And after a year advising a brigade of the Saudi Arabian National Guard, he joined the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College in 2018. He retired from the Army in 2022 and is now a civilian associate professor of history at the Command and General Staff College and the author of multiple books on military history. Bill, thank you so much for being with us today. And I'd love for you to, I've read the book, it was lovely. Tell us what made you decide to write this book?
Well, I started this book when I was writing my other book on mechanized cavalry. And silly, naive me, I thought that I would just be able to find an operational narrative of the United States Army and just insert the mechanized cavalry into it. Turns out there is no one volume that does that. You have to kind of pick and choose throughout. And some armies were easier than others. The Third Army, Patton's Third Army, literally leaps off the page. First Army, you can find a lot of cases because they were the guys that fought in Normandy, they fought across France, they fought in the Battle of the Bulge, Hurtgen Forest, all the big names. Easy enough to find. The Ninth Army was in for its fair share of heavy fighting in the area kind of north of Aachen. They helped supervise a reduction of Brest. They were the American element of the Rhine crossing with the 21st Army Group. They did all this stuff, but no one had written on them very much. Maybe individual battles here and there, but nothing all about them. And then I found this really interesting quote from Omar Bradley, who was the commander of the 12th Army Group. And he said, unlike the noisy and bumptious 3rd or the temperamental 1st, the 9th Army remained uncommonly normal. And if anybody's been around the military for more than a minute or two, you know that normal is very hard to do in a good day. And they did it in a combat zone with a lot of competing big personalities in the area. And everyone liked working with them. I joked they met the trifecta. Their bosses liked having them in their organization, their peers liked working with them, and their subordinates liked being in their organization. As a leader, you don't do better than that. So why? How did this come about? And so I kind of dug into it a little bit. Looked up a guy by the name of Thomas Stone, who had been done a lot of some of the initial research with Simpson, and actually talked to the man. And I came to the realization that the answer is that the commander and his chief of staff had put together a good team that followed doctrine, did things the Army way. We joke the right way, the wrong way, and the Army way. But there's a reason we have it the Army way. It's because people come in and out, and you don't want to change things up. And they just did the job. And it was shockingly simple answer, but it's one that I don't think gets nearly enough attention. So that's kind of what started me down this pathway. and kind of what I discovered as I came about.
So I have to confess, I thought I was fairly well informed of World War II, but Simpson and Moore were not names that jumped off the page at me initially, and I had to learn. And ultimately, they both became four-star generals. But Simpson and Moore, how they crossed paths and how they continued to sometimes separate but came back together throughout the course of really from the very early in the 1940s through the duration of the war. How did that happen?
I mean, why you haven't heard about these guys is that, quite frankly, for an army as big as we look at in World War II, it's shockingly how few people we do know. And for our own army, I'd challenge someone: do we know all the general officers or the colonels in our own army? Mm-hmm. And the answer is probably not. And now they were reasonably well known for their time because it was a very small army. In fact, it was a smaller army than what we have today. But the short answer is that they weren't well known because they never really put themselves in the limelight. And it was a deliberate choice. It wasn't like they just got passed over for being looked at. At the surrender of Brest, General Troy Middleton, who was the commander of the 8th Corps, who had done the tactical fighting to seize Brest, asked Simpson if he'd like to come and take the surrender. And Simpson said, "No, you got it." Now, Middleton actually passes this down even further to one of the division commanders, and then that's where that great line comes when the German asks the general for his credentials, and he sweeps his arm back to his soldiers, says, "These are my credentials." Great line there. But Simpson could have just short-circuited all of that and taken the surrender because he was the army commander. He chose not to. He almost always put his men and subordinate leaders out front because he figured his job, and he wasn't wrong, his job was to manage and supervise. And if they've done the hard fighting, they should get the credit. Now, how Simpson and Moore kind of came together and separated out, this is one of those grand old army stories of you meet the grandest people in the army. Simpson needed an aide. As generals do, he kind of put out a call. This is before Human Resources Command would send them a stack, and they would kind of leaf through it. But he just kind of put out a call to the infantry organizations in kind of the Southwest U.S. where he was. He was the assistant division commander for the 2nd Infantry Division, which at that point was in San Antonio. And he's like, "Hey, anybody in this area that's interested, come look me up." Well, Moore was an infantry officer up in, I'm talking without notes, and that's dangerous here, but up in Arkansas, Kansas, and says, "Hey, that sounds interesting." Talked to his friends. Simpson had a good professional reputation with them. Interviews for the job. And they kind of hit it off. They're both kind of the same personality, and not the same person, but the same enough personality. They both like discipline. They both like procedure. They both like doing things by the book. And that just kind of personality, and they both kind of meshed, and they just kept finding ways to work with each other. And this was not uncommon in the World War II American Army, and I would argue even in today's Army. You notice how certain people tend to kind of come together as groups, and there are many different reasons, but a lot of when done properly, it leads to an increased efficiency because you're not trying to learn a person all brand new. The chief of staff knows the boss, and that goes for a lot because when you're doing military decision making and the boss can't be there for whatever reason, the chief who's worked with the boss for years can go, "No, he's not going to do that," or "This is how he wants to see it."
So Simpson served, and I'm not tracking. I should remember this, but Simpson was a World War I soldier as well, and so he had seen and understood how doctrine was so incredibly. It was the imperative.
Yeah. Well, Simpson understood something, and also Simpson and George C. Marshall, although George C. Marshall comes a little bit later, is particularly in the World War, in that era, doctrine was becoming increasingly important to the U.S. Army. Bear in mind that we really didn't start writing doctrine down in books until the turn of the 20th century. Until that point, you had some drill manuals and all that kind of stuff, like great instructions for how to drill a platoon. But if you wanted to manage and organize an army, we didn't start writing that down until 1911, I want to say, maybe a little bit before. And he realized we were going to always be a citizen soldier army. We were going to have to bring in people, either draftees or volunteers, purely from civilian life, and not just use them as privates. We were going to have to induct them and use them as junior leaders and even mid-grade leaders throughout. And as such, you need to follow the process. It's there for a reason. Not saying you can't be creative. People often mistake following doctrine for being creative, for being not creative. Mm-hmm. No, that possibly. I mean, if people will often call the Soviets, oh, yeah, prescribed stuff. First off, that's kind of a caricature of a lot of Soviet doctrine, but that's a whole other conversation. But the idea being is that we have a set way of doing things, because then when it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you have to come up with something and you have to plan an attack. Gee, if somebody had only written a checklist for the things I need to think about while conducting an attack. Oh, wait, we have. And if we do it the same, and if you do the process for going over those things, you won't forget things. Now, I'll tell students, the military decision-making process, which is not what we used in World War II, but you will see the antecedents to it there, is it's like a goldfish. It will grow to fit the time allotted. So if you have 5 hours, you should take 5 hours. If you have 5 weeks, you should take 5 weeks. Alternatively, if you have 5 minutes, you can still kind of go through the process. You just won't do as much. But the idea being is that you have the checklist there for a reason. That's one of those things that Simpson kind of got right from the beginning, is that's what the doctrine was there to do, is to remove you of, well, what are the things I have to think about? Oh, I'll just break open the book and I'll follow the book. I'll follow the process. And shockingly, most of the time it works well enough. My joke is to the students, at Fort Leavenworth, the passing grade is a B. So I will tell students that the U.S. Army fights to the Leavenworth B. We want all the A students we can put our hands on. We want the superb people that just kind of get military operations. But most of the U.S. Army, particularly in times of war where we need large influxes of people, we need a good enough, repeatable process that can be executed by almost everybody. And that's what doctrine gives us, and that's what Simpson and Moore just kind of got from the get-go.
You know, one of the things that I've read a lot of World War II books, and this was one of the first ones, perhaps, that really struck me, that the size of the exercises that occurred stateside in preparation to send troops overseas, I had no earthly idea, to be honest with you, that it was massive. I mean, not like I've been at Fort Bragg, Fort Liberty, and I thought those were big exercises, but these went across state lines. They were massive. How did you learn about those?
It's kind of an interesting story. So in graduate school, you kind of learn about the Louisiana maneuvers, the 1941 maneuvers. And a lot of what that was that was the U.S. Army trying to certify a lot of different things at once. Quite frankly, I have a suspicion that George C. Marshall executed a lot of those because the Guard and Reserve, who had been federalized with the outbreak of World War II in Europe, we had federalized the Guard and the Reserve, and he needed to keep them on active duty a little bit longer. So he put basically the entire army into the field to see where we were at. And the answer was, of course, not good after even a year there. The Guard and the Reserve were not nearly the very professional organizations we think of today. They were very much mostly still in their infancy. The Guard and the Reserve had really only been constituted in the 1916, 1920s, very, very young organizations. There had been state militias prior to that, but the idea of the federal concept. And so we're trying to figure out, how do you stretch out an organization? Even at Fort Hood today, Fort Cavazos, excuse me. I graduated from Copper's Cove High School, so the old names are still stuck in my head a little bit. You can really only stretch out a battalion, maybe two, to its full doctrinal frontage before you literally run out of space. So that's one of the reasons why they started doing all of these. Now, what was interesting is that after the 40 maneuvers and the 41 maneuvers, we rapidly discovered that those weren't terribly useful. So what we do is we get these massive training areas, and then we would rotate corps and divisions into them, but they were doing multi-echelon training. So, like, the best example today is when we send a brigade to the National Training Center. I guess what we had done in the past, and I think what we're starting to do again, is we're sending a division headquarters out with them to exercise that part of the division. The same basic idea applied, which is you'd have multiple divisions. So you'd have a corps-sized training area up in Oregon. There was one down in the Desert Training Center in California. There was another one in Louisiana. There was another one in Tennessee. We started to consolidate as we were going through these. And so the divisions would be doing their individual division level exercises. And by the time you're actually out in the training area, all the individual and small unit collective are done. So this is not the time to do a regimental collective training event. This is a division collective training event. So so all three regiments are working together, working that piece. But it's just a division entire. Their adjacent units, who they are also talking to, are at different stages in the training process, and they're conducting their own division level exercises. But that doesn't matter, because as long as the cross flow is working to the staffs, you're still exercising the staffs. And then you had a corps headquarters in the box, so to speak, to use the modern terminology, that their job was to supervise all these 2 or 3 and sometimes 4 different level division exercises going on. And their only mission was to handle the actual reporting and disseminating orders and whatnot. You then had another corps headquarters that was providing the observer controller trainers, that was them providing the umpires, that was them providing all the 1,000,001 things that the ops group does out at the National Training Center or at the Joint Readiness Training Center or Joint Maneuver, JMRC, the one in Germany. So you have all these different echelons all training simultaneously. And what's amazing to me is how quickly we put this all together. And if you were, because we mobilized the Army in 1939 under the Protective Mobilization Plan. The last division flag was stood up in the summer of 1943. And that was, depending on how you do the math, we call it 89 full divisions. Now that included the regular and the Guard and the Reserve, plus the Army of the United States divisions that we stood up in addition. But if you can imagine basically building an army of 90 divisions and doing it in 3 years, the massive amount of just administrative work that went into that as we're going through there. It's what I joke with my students about all the time at the Command General Staff School. We teach majors. Is, guys, it's great that you can take a hill. but you know what will probably be your greatest contribution to the Army? Making sure that the supplies and the paperwork are all going to the right place and they're done correctly. That will probably be your greatest contribution to the Army. The combat arms guys look a little bit crestfallen when you tell them that, and then you ask if they want a hug, and then they get over it. But that's something that Simpson and Moore kind of intuitively got, is processes and systems, making this big green machine stand up very rapidly and then do something.
So I do want to encourage the audience to please do send in some questions for us. We do have a question, and it's asking, what did George Marshall think about Simpson as a commander?
Simpson was an interesting character with Marshall in that he was not really on Marshall's top list. In fact, Simpson was a little on the old side for what Marshall really wanted to have for his leaders. Marshall actually had a age cut line where if you were too old, you did not go forward into theater. In fact, in many cases, you were told to retire. And that didn't matter whether you were a reservist, a guardsman, or active duty. If you were over a certain age, you didn't go. Marshall thought Simpson was a very good infantry officer, but he was not his first pick. Interestingly enough, one of Marshall's first picks was a guy by the name of Lloyd Friedendahl, who commanded the U.S. Second Corps at a place called Kasserine Pass, which most people have heard of the name of the Kasserine Pass. They don't necessarily have heard of Lloyd Friedendahl. And what it was is that Marshall kind of, the story of Marshall having an actual black book of all of his, of all the people that he thought were up and comers. To my knowledge, no one has ever discovered that the physical copy of that book to be a reality. Don't think that really happened. But it was a small enough army that everyone of a particular year group knew each other. And so Marshall kind of looked at Simpson as a capable officer. He was picked to command not one, but two different divisions. And both of them, interesting enough, started out life as National Guard divisions. And that was because the politics between the Guard and the active duty are, of course, all very, very fraught during this time frame. I want to say the 17 Guard divisions, 16 of them had their commanders relieved prior to entering combat. There was one Guard commander that rose to the rank of Corps command in the entire war. So there's a lot of push and shove between the Guard and the regular forces. And the 30th Infantry Division, which is near and dear to my heart because it's Kansas and Missouri National Guard now. The division commander, a guy by the name of Major General Truman, yes, cousin to, at the time, Senator Truman, needed to be relieved due to perceived poor performance by Marshall. Well, when your cousin is the chair, I don't know if he's the chairman, but definitely on the Armed Forces Committee of the Senate, you need to handle that very carefully. And Simpson had served in a National Guard division in World War I as an active duty officer, but in a National Guard division. So he was seen as a politically safe choice to send to the Guard. Hey, he knows you guys, he understands you guys, he's worked with you before, he'll give you a fair shake. That was kind of why Simpson got chosen to go over there. Marshall also rewarded Simpson by sending him to another division, the 30th Division, at this point, Southeastern United States National Guard. I think they're Georgia, South Carolina these days. And their division commander had been relieved again for poor performance. And Simpson is sent over there again. So Marshall's sending him basically as his troubleshooter to kind of fix broken divisions. But Marshall's thinking very carefully about how he's doing it, because he's taking a guy with National Guard experience who has a rapport and kind of is seen as not just somebody who doesn't understand what the Guard is. Now with the 30th, though, Marshall, I don't know if Marshall did this or whether it was Hugh Drum, who's commander of the training army commander that the 30th was a part of. But very interesting story there is that Simpson had to come in and basically he was tasked to clean house. And that was remove all the leadership that was not performing and instill leadership that was. Obviously, a commander who does that is not going to be very popular, because he's relieving established, well thought out, established, in many cases, popular leaders. Maybe not effective leaders, but popular. So Simpson does this for about a couple months and has to be the bad guy. But by the same token, he establishes some rapport with the troops. The great story of Simpson, who most of the time you see him, he has his hat on because he went bald at a very early age. And so he tells the soldiers, guys, you need haircuts. And then he sweeps off his helmet and says, see, I wouldn't tell you to do anything that I wouldn't do myself, to general humor. Then, of course, soldiers started shaving their heads, and he had to tell them, no, I didn't mean to shave your heads. I just meant get a haircut, be neat, be Army. So he does this, and he starts to build a rapport, but he is the bad guy, at least to some. The division commander actually wrote a book called The Purge of the 30th Division. Very fascinating book when you can put your hands on it. But then, after Simpson's the bad guy and starts getting the division on the right track, Marshall then pulls him and lets him go be a corps commander. So you bring someone in to be the bad guy, and then once they're on the right track, then you can bring in another equally good commander, a guy by the name of Leland Hobbs, who would command the division throughout most of the war. And now he can take advantage of the fact that the division's on the right track, and he can take advantage of, oh, well, at least I'm not the bad guy, right? Mm-hmm. And there's some kind of upper-level senior command jujitsu going on there that again, I don't know whether it was drama or whether it was Marshall that figured it all out. But there's some very interesting level analysis and thought and leadership thought of how do I use my commanders to best effect.
Yeah, one of the questions we have, did Simpson and Moore come up with any innovations in large unit training?
Not terribly.
They stuck to doctrine.
They, I guess one of their big innovations, if you call it that, is they just insisted that people follow what was written down, and that's harder than it sounds, because you get a bunch of leaders that will want to do their own thing, and Simpson's like, no, do it this way. And a lot of what it was is it's not just, hey, we have it written down this way, we'll have to do it this way. You can get away with doing innovative things when you're a small team that all know each other and you work together for years and years and years. This is why our Special Operations Command is so good, right? They all live together for a long period of time. Senior unit combat is not like that. The United States Army was designed so that the field army would be the administrative headquarters, commanding any number of several corps, tactically commanding, and then the divisions would be where the rubber meets the road. But depending on the flow of the battle, you can retask organize a corps almost at will. Additionally, even within the division, we'd pulled all the enablers out. Now, there's good parts about this and bad parts about this. There's no tank battalion, there's no tank destroyer battalion, there's a signal battalion, but that's really about it. Basically, the division has just enough to fight an infantry battle, and that's it. All the enablers are pulled out. But then when the division needs to fight, all those enablers are then put back in on a task-organized basis. What that means is that when you go to fight a battle, you might be fighting a battle with somebody you just met. And if you have to take that guy aside and say, this is how we do TPS reports in this division, or this corps, or this field army, that's a problem. Because they're just trying to figure out how to make the organization flow, and you're trying to and they've got to fight a battle. So it's like, no, in the army, yellow 5 is a yellow 5 is a yellow 5. A green 2 is a green 2. These are report formats, modern report formats, as my old Cav Squadron XO brain kicks in. It's the same way. Line 4 on a yellow 5 is line 4 on a yellow 5. I don't care whether you're in the 1st Armored Division, the 1st Infantry Division, or the 82nd Airborne. They're all the same for a reason, because a tank battalion could be attached wherever, particularly in World War II. Mm-hmm. So innovation, I never saw anything where they were like, oh, this is a great idea. What they did do was do the Army processes efficiently and correctly, and really made people stand to it.
Yeah, another question we have, Simpson and Moore spent a long time together as commander and chief of staff. Are there other examples of this kind of partnership? And it says, and is this a pattern that the current Army should emulate?
First part of the question, yes. So Patton had a very similar relationship with both of his chief of staff. Gay, I cannot remember who the other one came up with. Gaffey, maybe. But Patton had a very similar relationship with his chiefs of staff. He brought his staff with him throughout. Omar Bradley brought a lot of his staff with him from place to place to place. Interestingly enough, and someone should do a study on this, so if any graduate students are listening, this is a great area for research, is if you look at the lieutenant colonels and the colonels, which I know, you might sit there and think, junior people on a staff, yeah, when you're talking about armies and army groups, yes. But Bradley seemed to take a core group with him throughout, and staff officers and general officers would do this pretty frequently. For instance, the staff of the 12th Army Group was, in many cases, the same core group of individuals that had been with Omar Bradley in Tunisia in 1943. Now, that actually isn't that long when you think about it, but 2 years at war is actually pretty long. So that same group of core staffers that is with Bradley through there, that then go with him to Tunisia, Sicily, that then come with him and stand up the U.S. First Army in England that then come with him across the channel, and then they go with him kind of throughout. Is this a good thing? Yes, in moderation. The reason I say yes, it's a good thing is like, yeah, you get to know each other. A staff always works best when it understands its boss, because doctrine will only take you so far. Some bosses really like the digital common operating pictures. Other bosses really like the hard copy map ones. That's not a doctrine thing. That's just a commander preference thing. Knowing that the boss likes to hear, the level of detail that the boss needs to hear about, all these other kind of getting to know you things. The more you can kind of streamline that process, the better everything runs, right? It can't help be. Where you run into problems is a couple places. One is you can end up in groupthink. Everyone kind of becomes very, very insular. This is what actually happened in the first Army staff. I say is where there's research done. I'd really be fascinating to know is like how far down this went. We know the senior folks pretty well, but how far down did this group of people traveling around with each other go? But yeah, you get this whole not invented here approach, right? And then the other problem that you really run into after a while is it gets also, and you saw this again in First Army, which is us against the world. Because the British and the American forces had a lot of friction, shall we say, in Tunisia. And rightfully so. The American forces were brand new. We were rookies. We did not perform as well as we would have liked, as well as everybody would have liked. That doesn't mean the Brits were performing all well themselves, but you have a staff that kind of gets put down, seen as kind of the rookies and the new guys. Well, you kind of get a chip on your shoulder after a while, rightfully so, at least to a degree, right? There's always some measures here, right? Well, that's now the same group now later that is commanding or leading an Army group in multinational operations, where the people to their left are the 21st Army group, which is a Commonwealth Army, Canadian, 1st Canadian, 2nd British. And underneath that, you also have Poles, you have Czechs, you have any number of different nationalities throughout there. To your right is, yes, it's the American 6th Army group, but half of that is the 1st French Army. So what that means is that if you get to the point where you have all of these personal relationships, they can actually become a detriment, which is, when you work with someone so long that you actually don't like them anymore and you can't stand to be around them, that becomes a problem. And in First Army, you really see a lot of political infighting because people have been together so long that they've kind of built their own little empires, and they don't play nice. So for this to work, you almost have to have the right personalities, which I find is an irony, that in order for the personality not to matter, you need to have the right personalities, which I know is a non sequitur, but but if you think about it, where people are just focused on doing the job and not having it be about the personality, that requires a very specific kind of person and a very specific kind of training and command climate and command culture to be built into that. So
the answer of worthy of emulation is it all depends.
Which I know is a great academic answer, but not very useful military one. But yes, and what it really comes down to is it depends very heavily upon the leader who is managing that organization. If the leader encourages us versus them mentality, if the leader encourages people kind of building up their own fiefdoms, if they allow personality strife, that's a problem. Alternatively, again, what was interesting about Simpson and Moore is that they kind of nipped a lot of that in the bud. You just didn't see it there. And I think a lot of it just started with the commander up front saying, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And he just didn't give the space for it to grow. And you knew you either did it according to the Army way, or you were probably on your way. Now, to be fair, they didn't send any of their primary. They sent one primary packing, and that was a guy that was relieved for health reasons. that Simpson actually related later in life was probably a little bit more. The guy was not as capable as he should have been. But again, they kind of it was less. In that particular case, the guy just wasn't performing to standard. He could not get through, so he's like, "Okay, you're done. You're out of here." Soldiers see that, and you think back to it, and it doesn't take too many examples before soldiers, and I will include staff officers as soldiers, because again, we're all soldiers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is people get the message quick, fast, and in a hurry. This is just how we behave in this organization, and quite frankly, everyone prefers being in that organization. There are sociopaths out there that like building their empires and whatnot, but really, what it comes out to is you like being in an organization where you can come in and just do your job. You can speak up and have a difference of opinion, and it's not a personal vendetta. It's just business.
Mm-hmm.
And Simpson's and he also supported his leadership throughout, and everyone kind of got that. There's a port where the Ninth Army was attacking across the Ruhr Plain from the Ruhr River to the Rhine, and you had two corps. One corps was getting held up, and the other corps was breaking loose, but the corps boundary was getting in the way. And when you're up at senior echelons, you don't cross corps boundaries. That's a bad thing. When you're firing artillery brigades and groups of aircraft are in the air, you don't just freestyle that, right? It's very heavily controlled. And the corps commander that had the opportunity told the Corps G3, who was out doing battlefield circ, "I think I can break loose." Corps G3 looks at the situation. He's the Army G3. He's the Army G3. The Army G3 looks at the situation and goes, "You're right. On my authority, execute. We're changing the boundary." Tell both of the corps they executed. The corps commander who had lost ground in the boundary shift complained to Simpson. So at that point, Army corps commanders were 2 stars, but a corps commander complaining to an Army commander about a Army staff officer who at that point was a full colonel. So you have a 2-star yelling at complaining to a 3-star about a colonel. Typically, or oftentimes we hear that and we think it's going to be bad for the colonel. Now Simpson looked at it and went, "No, the G3 understood what he was doing. No, denied. My staff officer, he's my G3. If I can't trust him to make these kinds of calls, I'll get a different G3. But when he speaks for me." And that level of trust built up throughout the organization. When Simpson's out doing battlefield circ, and this is what endeared him to me as a staff officer, he'd go out and do battlefield circulation. And a division, I'm going to pick random examples here, but this is true throughout. Say the 30th Infantry Division reports, we are short 105 millimeter artillery ammunition. Rather than doing as we've all seen some bosses do, which is immediately when they're informed of a problem, they start pulling levers. Start getting on the phone, calling, all that kind of stuff. Instead, he goes, "Got it. Are people dying right now because of it? Okay, no. Got it. Someone will get back to you." He goes back to his Army headquarters. He looks his chief of staff in the eye and says, "Hey, did you know the 30th Infantry Division was running short on 105? A couple things are happening." And again, morning and afternoon staff briefings, battlefield rhythm or battle rhythm events. Everyone knows that it's there. 2 things will happen. One, the chief of staff would go, "Yes, sir, I'm aware the 30th Infantry Division is short on 105. These are the steps we've taken to prevent it. I'll make sure that I circle back with the 30th Infantry because it sounds like they weren't being informed of what the answer was." Never mind that a commander would occasionally try and short circuit a staff process by going through command channels, because that never happens.
Never.
The other thing that we might do is like, "Oh, that's a surprise.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to know why that's a surprise. And then could you give me a couple hours to shake my trees and figure it out?" And then in the morning staff briefing, the more would say, "Hey, sir, we researched it. This is why. This is what we're doing about it." But the idea being is that they didn't go off. Is that Simpson and then Moore also by extension? They didn't go off half-cocked. They thought it through and they worked it through, and everyone saw that and then incorporated that themselves, even when it galled them. So,
were there any subordinate staffers to Simpson and Moore that are like luminaries, names that the audience would recognize?
It's something I haven't researched a lot, but the short answer is not really. And that to me is more, that to me is kind of neat in a way, in a bad way, maybe a good way and a bad way, I don't know, but I like it, it's neat. And that's because for all the big names that are out there in the Army, the Pattons, the Montgomery, well, Montgomery's British Army, but Marshall, McNair, Eisenhower, all these big names, right? They don't make the Army run. The Army runs off of faceless and often nameless staff officers just putting their head down doing the job. That's what makes the Army run. And they don't want their name in a book. They don't want to get that. They might like some recognition every now and then, like but it's not even normally a medal. Most of these guys would have taken a slap on the back and a good job. That's not a World War II thing. I would argue the Army of today is like that. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you see for every big name that's out there. Most of these guys are just out there doing the job, making the Army happen. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we don't know them says a lot more about us not digging into it than, as I say, I researched these guys, and I'd have to go and open a book to tell you who some of these special staff officers are. And they're okay with that because the Army succeeded. At the end of the day, we got to the Elbe, didn't get to Berlin, we let the Soviets do that. Mm-hmm. But we got to the Elbe, we crushed Nazi Germany, and more of our soldiers came home because we did our job properly. That's success.
Absolutely. So how did Simpson get along with commanders that were as different as, say, Bradley or Montgomery?
Honestly, pretty well. He did pretty well. Because again, there's some. We were actually teaching a class on this at the CGSS called emotional intelligence, and he kind of just took them for who they were. Remember, Patton was actually a classmate of Simpson's, and they both had struggled in math. I'm sure there was some bonding there, and Simpson kind of knew that he didn't always really approve of all of Patton's command style. He thought Patton was a little too bit brusque and whatnot. Certainly not his style. But he kind of let that roll. When Hodge's First Army kind of cheated the Ninth Army out of a significant amount of supplies, there's a whole long sordid story where they're changing corps headquarters, and First Army takes the opportunity to kind of move, lateral transfer a lot of stuff from one dump that they own to another dump. But at the end of it, and Simpson's informed of this, he goes, guys, they're the main effort. We're about ready to cross the line of departure here in just a week or two. This is not the time to get involved in squabbling, and he just executes. And what's interesting is that when Hodges calls him up, not a month later, about a month and a half later, excuse me, and says, help, because the Battle of the Bulge just happened. Mm-hmm. Simpson doesn't even wait for orders. He immediately launches his only reserve without any orders to the assistance of Hodges. Montgomery, they got along pretty well. There were some cases where there was some friction. That is a true statement. But typically the way he handled it is that if he had concern, like Montgomery had not included Simpson's army in command of crossing the Rhine. That's the main event. That's the show. That's what we've all been dreaming of. And you're told by your boss, no, your headquarters is going to sit this one out. He doesn't go crying to Bradley. He doesn't go crying to Eisenhower. He goes up to Montgomery and says, hey, boss, I have a significant issue with this. This is my proposed fix. Is there some hard feelings between Dempsey and Simpson? Dempsey is the commander of the 2nd British Army, who was their adjacent unit in the Rhine crossing. Over a bridge? Yes. Do they get over it? Yes. Again, these aren't saints. They're going to yell at each other from time to time. I mean, we've all been there on day 10 in the box. But the difference being is that he didn't seem to take a vendetta against it. He's not out there in 1948 or 1950 writing a tell-all about how I got it over on the First Army or the 2nd British. No, he just he was proud of his service. He just did the job. And did that mean sometimes there was some friction? Yeah, but overall, considering what we know of that entire theater, remarkably little friction, to the point that people really liked working with the 9th Army. It's like, oh, good, they're on our flank. You know, those organizations like in your brigade and all that kind of stuff. There's some battalions you like having, particularly it's Cav Squadron, right? There's some battalions you really want to be the one you're doing the passage with, and some of them that,
Not
okay,
so much.
but yeah, it's just being a professional.
This is going to be my very last question. We only have a couple of minutes. Is, as I was reading this, now that I'm no longer I'm a soldier for life, but I'm no longer an actively serving soldier. And I run a business, and I have a chief of staff. I'm the president of the organization. I have a chief of staff. And I read this through a very different lens as a business book and realized the value, because the chief of staff I have now, we couldn't part ways. If she goes, I go, kind of a thing. It's that important. And so to really understand the Simpson and Moore relationship, how would you tell people to apply these two personalities, these two roles, not only in a military lens, but from a business perspective?
Trust. And that is, you have to find somebody who you can find a trustworthy individual. So they have to be competent, they have to be trustworthy. Those are kind of the gates of entry, right? And those are what we hope all of our officers are. And then you mean it when you say you trust them. There's a lot of different personalities out there. Some will work, some will not. But if you give someone the job and you say, I trust you to do this, you got to mean it. Yeah. Otherwise, what's the point? And now that is very, very hard to do. Particularly, like I'm a very hands-on kind of personality. That was one of my hardest lessons that I had to learn as a leader. And you can ask some of my former subordinates how well I did. I'm not claiming I was always successful, not even a little bit. But that's what I learned from watching Simpson Moore, is just the absolute and utter trust that they placed in each other. Because Simpson trusted Moore to run things as he asked them to be ran. And then Moore then trusted his superior, Simpson, to have his back at all times. Mm-hmm. And to my knowledge, they never broke that. What was interesting was talking with Colonel Tom Stone, again, the guy that actually got to interview Simpson, where all the interviews come from in this book, or at least most of them. Moore and Simpson remained friends until their deaths. Wow. To the point where Moore was still acting like Simpson's chief of staff when they were in their 80s.
See, that's what I'm hopeful that we will have. And I wish we had more time to continue this conversation. Yeah. This is fun. And I would encourage folks, get this book, because it really is much more applicable than just a great history lesson. So Bill, thank you so much for taking the time. And now let me hand it back over to General Smith.
Awesome. Thank you.
Wow. What a great discussion. Before we part, I want to inform our viewers of a few upcoming events. AUSA will host a coffee series on 23 July featuring Lieutenant General Sean A. Gainey, Commanding General of the United States Army Space and Missile Defense Command. On 30 July, AUSA will host a noon report with Dr. Lester Martinez-Lopez, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. On 4 September, AUSA will host an aviation hot topic at the AUSA headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. We will also host another noon report on 24 September featuring Major General Johnny K. Davis, Commanding General of the U.S. Army Recruiting Command in Fort Knox, and Brigadier General Antoinette Gant, Chief, Army Enterprise Marketing Office. The Army's AUSA annual meeting will be 14th to 16 October at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in Washington, D.C. I hope you can join us for an upcoming webinar or an event. For more information about any of these events or to register, please visit our website at ausa.org. Finally, we thank you for all of those who support us with your membership. Membership matters. Your help helps us support the Army. Thank you again for attending and have a great Army Day. Hua.